Welcome back to CTN. I'm your host, Robert Van Sluten. Let's get started. In a very early episode of CTN, we created an application called Slider, and I demonstrated what happens when you rotate it. You notice the alignment is very poor. You really don't want the slider that far down, and the label that off center. In this episode, we're going to fix the alignment problem when we rotate. But before we do that, we're going to start with even a simpler case. What I have on the screen is a very simple iPhone app. In the lower right-hand corner, there's a label with the text "Hello." If I click on the background canvas and I take a look at the file inspector, you'll notice there's a checkbox that says Use Autolayout. That's what you get by default. Now what I want to do is I want to go over to the view controller and I want to take a look at its attributes, and you'll notice there's this notion of simulated metrics, and there's one for orientation. Currently it's portrait. I'm going to change that to landscape. What that allows you to do is simulate the rotation without using the simulator. But you'll note that the hello label has disappeared because the aspect ratio changed and the geometry doesn't make any sense for where that was located. Go back to portrait. It comes back. Now you'd think that, well, I have auto layout turned on. Isn't that going to do something magical for me? No, because auto layout is based on something called constraints. Constraints are rules about what happens to views. And by default, there aren't any. You have to create them. Go to the next slide and we'll start looking at that. Okay, the first thing I want to point out is that I have this label selected and I move it around. You'll see these blue guidelines. It's just telling me that if I place it here, it's in the corner. They're guides. Now, that doesn't necessarily trigger a constraint. It just says that it's possible to build constraints over the fact that that was positioned there. Now, if I go down to these buttons, and you've probably been wondering what these are, we're going to focus on two of them. One is Resolve Auto Layout Issues, and the other one is Align. Now, if I have this label selected, and I bring up the menu for Resolve Auto Layout Issues, we have two groups of items here. The lower one is for the view controller views in general, and the top one is for the particular view selected. Now down on the bottom it says clear all constraints in view controller. Now we have no constraints, so clearing it really doesn't do anything. But if you had some and you want to get rid of all of them, you can do that. At this point, what we're going to do is we're going to say reset to suggested constraints in view controller. In other words, we've laid out items, we've done it based on the blue guidelines, and we want the system to automatically come up with automatic constraints. Let's select that. Now if we select the view controller and we go over and we change the orientation from portrait to landscape, let's see what happens. It fixed the problem. Now let's go over to the slider application, which is a little bit more complicated. Okay, the game plan is I want to place the label in the center of the view, horizontally and vertically. And I want to space the slider some distance below the label. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring over the outline, because we're going to be looking at that. And I also I want to select the size inspector, because it's going to show me the constraints that are applied to whichever view is selected. We're going to simply start with the label. That's one we want to center. And this time we're going to go to the alignment button here. Down at the bottom we're going to select horizontal center and vertical center and add 2 constraints. We're getting a complaint here, and that's actually showing up in the outline. And the complaint is that, yeah, you've implied the constraints, but the label's not there. If I go over here, let's pull the window over, and I actually click on the symbol here, it'll give me the option of fix misplacement. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So it's actually placed the label in the center. Now I'm going to just move the slider out of the way here. We'll go to the next slide and we'll start dealing with it. Okay, this one is a little bit trickier. I have this slider selected, and I'm going to start by saying I want it aligned horizontally. One constraint. Now I get a bunch of complaints here. It's complaining about a few things. One is it wants a vertical constraint, and it also wants to know about the width. And the way I'm going to resolve the width is by dragging on itself. It's kind of weird. And I'm simply going to say constrain width. Now in terms of vertical, I want it spaced some distance underneath the label. So I can control drag from the slider to the label. Create a constraint, vertical spacing. We're fully defined now. Now let's actually go and test. If I select the view controller and I go over to the attribute inspector and I go to orientation, you may wonder what inferred is. Inferred is the default that you get when the application starts, and it turns out to be portrait. Let's go to landscape. Let's go back to portrait. It works very nicely. Now, you may ask 2 questions. Can you do these programmatically? Yes. Is this much more complicated than it looks? Yes, it is. There's a lot of parameterization you can do. There's such things as priorities and so on and so forth. We've basically just scratched the surface. But for most simple cases, you can get away with what I've shown you. That's it. The improved slider will be on the website, cocotouchnetcast.com. Thanks for watching.